one way to think about authentic relating is like authentic relating. It's a dance of polarities. How do I hold two things as true at the same time? The both and. So rather than relationships being this zero-sum game where either like you're getting what you want or I'm getting what I want, or we're compromising to the point where neither of us are really getting what we want, how do we do both? Like, how do I really stand in my dignity to know myself, to know my boundaries, my needs, my desires? How am I bringing them into the relationship in a way that I can allow them to be met and I'm not attached to the outcome, which is a skill that I'm still learning? And then how am I doing that with another person who is also going through all of that? How am I being curious about what it is that they want, need and desire without making the assumptions? We're in this dance of honor self and honor other.
Welcome to the Heart of Man podcast, a podcast for any man seeking to live in alignment with his deepest core and lead a life of profound meaning and connection. I'm your host, Alex Lehman, and I'm here to empower you through transformative conversations, eye-opening insights, and practical wisdom. Join me now as we venture into the heart of man. Let's dive in. Vix Anderton is a somatic coach, authentic relating teacher, author, and self-described recovering perfectionist. In her own words, she spent over 15 years chasing achievement, striving to feel good enough, all in high-stress environments. This included her service in the UK Royal Air Force and working as an advisor and consultant in corporate settings. In pursuit of deeper liberation by working for herself, she doubled down on her familiar strategies of perfectionism, which ultimately led to burnout in her corporate role and set her on a journey of healing and deeper self-discovery. Drawing on her extensive experience in high-stress environments, from war zones to boardrooms, her work today is rooted in the foundational understandings of embodiment, using the principles of the nervous system, cyclical living, and authentic relating to help resonating perfectionists bravely build more sustainable and authentic ways of being. Her passion lies in helping individuals overcome the internalized oppression that perfectionism brings upon us, enabling them to reconnect with themselves, others, and the world around them. She's dedicated to guiding others in unlocking their inner wisdom, nurturing resilience, and expanding their embodied range, empowering them to navigate life's uncertainties with more grace and confidence. Within our conversation together, we address this phenomenon of perfectionism, discussing it as a coping mechanism that leads to unhelpful strategies in life, which tend to lead to repetitive behaviors that are not so helpful for our long-term happiness nor well-being. Rather than supporting us, they become a collection of habits and patterns we use to protect ourselves. And while these mechanisms can be highly effective, they do come at a very high cost, which is, in our attempts to guard ourselves, we also prevent ourselves from being truly seen by others. We discuss how the essential pillars of embodied awareness and resourcing ourselves can support the development of deeper range, allowing us to discover new ways of operating so we're no longer confined by these old strategies. We also touch on the modality of authentic relating, which has deeply influenced me on my own journey a few years back, supporting me to recover a deeper authenticity with myself and also foster deeper connection with others. And within that, we explore elements such as authenticity and what it truly means to experience a relational intimacy with someone. At its core, we explore that the more deeply we welcome every aspect of ourselves, the more comfortable we become in our own authentic expression, reducing the need to hide behind masks such as perfectionism. If you're a man who perpetually struggles under the weight of your inner critic, demanding more from yourself, seeking perfection, yet at the same time desiring deeper harmony with yourself and others, this one's for you. I feel incredibly excited to jump on this conversation today. So really honoring and inviting Vix Anderton to the podcast. She's an embodiment coach, and she's as well an authentic relating facilitator who helps individuals nurture a sense of resilience and leadership into their lives through different modalities, different practices such as cyclical wisdom, authentic relating, and as well embodiment. So Vix, I welcome you into the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alex.
One of the conversations that I really wanted to get into with you was around this area of perfectionism, which is something that I often observe among the men that I work with. And one of the things that I heard you speak of, which definitely struck a chord for me, was speaking about bringing tender discipline into an individual's work lives and really working with that element of perfectionism. So I'm curious to hear, just to begin into this conversation, I would like to know what made this conversation around perfectionism really important to you, and as well, how did it play out in your own life?
Big questions to start with. It took me a long while to realize that I was a perfectionist. And I think I approached it in the same way that I hear a lot of my clients do, which is like, well, I'm not perfect enough to be a perfectionist. And I think that's for me at least, a big misunderstanding around what perfectionism really is. Like, I don't think it is really about meticulously dotting I's and crossing T's. It is for some people, but I think it's fundamentally a story of I'm not enough. So how do I project an image into the world that has everybody else convinced that maybe I am enough, as a way of keeping me safe? That kind of really landed for me in actually really quite recently. It was about 2021. And I'd been doing some trauma work. I trained as an embodied coach and facilitator, and for the first time in my life, I was really seeing this this dynamic that I was in, which was one where this kind of vicious cycle of either always being on and kind of like nervous system activation, hypervigilant, like do, control everything, like really forward, really gripping, everything's tight. The kind of the overachieving kind of version of perfectionism, this kind of relentless need to do, because if I'm not doing, then like how am I ever going to tell anybody that I'm enough? So it was on one extreme, and then on the other extreme was the kind of like the hopeless collapse. Oh, I'm just an awful human being. I'm never going to be good enough. It's never going to. So I might as well give up. There's kind of like real like lack of energy. So kind of the dorsal parasympathetic activation of the nervous system.
Sure.
So an authentic relating, kind of posture and collapse. These two extremes. Yeah, it was seeing that, and it was like suddenly my world made sense. I was like, oh, I make sense, right? All of the decisions that I've made, and this kind of like, yeah, this slightly sort of fragmented sense of self that I had. So I was like, these two versions of me don't feel coherent. And yeah, so my journey before that had been working on that, but not being able to label it explicitly as perfectionism. And as soon as I saw it in me, it was like I was seeing it in a lot of my clients. I was seeing it really in the world. Like, it's, for me, perfectionism isn't just it's not an individual, it's not a character flaw, full stop. But it's not just an individual issue.
Yeah.
Like, it's a socialized way of being. Like, we're taught to be perfectionist in this way. We are taught explicitly that we are not enough. Everything is, we're commodified. Do more, be more, grow faster. Even like the self-help, the self-development industry says there's something fundamentally broken about you, and if only you buy this program or read this book, then you get to be a whole version of yourself. So I see it everywhere. It's like really this form of like internalized oppression. And for me, like, tender discipline is this beautiful concept. It's not my words. It comes from a woman called Jocelyn C. Glei, who runs a podcast called Hurry Slowly. But I have, I always credit her with it, but I've like taken it full-heartedly and been like, this is one of the things, because perfectionism invites us into this like binary thinking. The world is black or white. It's either or. It's good or bad. And from a nervous system perspective, that makes a lot of sense, because when we're in survival mode, that is the easiest way to see the world. Like, are you good for me or are you bad for me?
Right.
Really simple. But there's no choice in that. I think this is one of the reasons that perfectionists can really struggle. It's like, well, I don't want to do this thing anymore because that really hurts. And I don't want to do this thing anymore because that really hurts, but I don't have any other choice. And so tender discipline is all about like all of the space in the middle that says, yes, the discipline is important. Like, life is hard, and if you want to do things in the world, it requires you to show up for yourself, and it requires you to do things that are often not very comfortable. but it's not a form of discipline that says, well, now completely override all of your needs, all of your feelings, numb out in order to do the thing. It brings in this aspect of deep connection and tenderness and compassion that says your needs, your cycles, your energy are also things that are worth honoring, and that you can do both.
It's a lot here. First of all, thank you, Will, for sharing your own personal experiences and story with that. And, just want to name as well on a personal level, I can very much relate to it. And this is as well something that I regularly see among the male clients I work with, which is why I found this such an interesting conversation point just for us to explore. So I just want to reflect a few things back that I really heard out that I found to be very fascinating, and potentially we can go in a little bit deeper into those. But the first thing that really stuck out for me was that perfectionism is actually not really about striving to be perfect. It's not a strive for excellence or sense of mastery, but it's actually more a desire to mask some form of wound around inadequacy, not feeling good enough as we are. And so as long as we have this mask on, no one can really touch us. And like that was definitely one of my biggest tendencies. The other thing that I really saw as well within myself, it was this way that I was trying to keep myself safe in the world. And it was this way of how I was exerting control over myself, overriding, as you said, a lot of my own intrinsic bodily responses of what my body may want to do or not want to do. And just looking into in a very binary way of, okay, what do I need to do right now in order to get my needs met, right? So it's interesting how our very intrinsic, I'm going to say even like childhood primal needs are playing in, and we find these survival mechanisms that we're now trying to move through the world with. So with that, I'm really curious if we speak to an individual who can relate to this pattern and can find themselves in these tendencies, how can we start to explore unwinding that? It really does seem that this sense of not enoughness is really at the root of what's there. So I'm curious, if an individual comes to you with that, how do you start navigating this?
Yeah, the first place is always acceptance for me. As you said, these are coping strategies. I think the irony of perfection is people show up and they're like, well, it means I need to not be a perfectionist. I need to chop this off. I need to even the phrasing of like unwinding. It says, oh, like this is something that isn't desirable, and I would be better. Like I would be more enough if I didn't do this anymore. And it's like it's fundamentally like shifting that kind of way of thinking to say, great, you're a perfectionist. Congratulations. Right? If it wasn't this, you'd have learned to do something else, because I don't know anybody who makes it through childhood without developing a coping strategy. Like this is what it means to be human, at least what it means to be human in a late stage patriarchal white supremacist culture. Like you have to cope. So congratulations, your nervous system is doing exactly what it evolved to do, and it's doing its best to keep you safe.
Can I just jump in here for a moment? Because I'm listening into some of the listeners here, and some of the, especially male listeners, will think, well, that feels really passive. That feels like, how will this help me, this realm of acceptance? And I just want to name, like, I follow the same approach as you, right? But I want to speak into that element where the listener may feel like, well, how will this help me?
Yeah, it's because it's this, right? If you come at this as a problem that needs to be solved, then all you're doing is applying the same perfectionist thinking. So you're applying the same problem to try and be a solution to the problem, right?
Yeah.
And like logically, that doesn't work. Like if you keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same outcomes. Okay? And it is completely possible to approach working with perfectionism, and therefore nothing actually really shifts. Maybe some surface stuff does, but fundamentally underneath, you're going to be in exactly the same place. So for me, the acceptance part is saying, like it's the welcome everything practice from authentic relating. It is turning towards reality as it is. It is one of the bravest things that you can do. Like, it is not passive. Like, it's not oh, okay, this is what it is, and like I'm surrendering, and like it's all just gonna, like, no, it's like it takes such steel and strength to turn towards reality and be like, yes, right, this is how it is, this is how I am, and to not need to change anything. Okay? To say, right, as I am is fundamentally okay. And at the same time, because it's the both and, this coping strategy is now having consequences in my life that I don't like.
Yeah.
Like, I've been approaching life with a hammer and everything looks like a nail and I'm breaking stuff, right? It's like, okay, well, I want to learn to do more than hit stuff. So I need more tools in my toolbox. Another way of thinking about it is like, you imagine you learnt to run as a kid. You're like, great, running's awesome. Okay, running will take you all sorts of places. But as a, you're running over like land for most of your life, and then suddenly you hit a lake. And like, I want to get to the other side of the lake. Well, running's not going to be any good for you. Like, you need to learn something different.
Right.
And so it's this approach to any kind of personal work. And this is where I think, perfectionism kind of lives in our society that says you have to be a better person. It's about learning to have more tools in your toolbox, to expand your range so that when situations come up, you can respond in a way that is both authentic and appropriate. So it's saying, yeah, great. Like, perfectionism here, that's what I've learned. I've been practicing that for 30, 40 years. Really good at it. Wonderful. Congratulations. And wouldn't it be helpful to learn some other ways of being? So it's I guess it's a less direct route. You don't actually really need to touch the perfectionism. Like, cool, that gets to stay. But what would it be like to show up in the world in these different ways, to be able to have more choice?
Mm-hmm. What would that look like? I'm curious to hear. If someone wants to embark on that journey and wants to explore, I'm going to say, increasing more range so they have more choice options of how to navigate things. What would those be? How would you gently ease someone into trying something new?
So this is where I love embodied work, because working with the body is stickier, quicker, and deeper than anything else.
Tell me more.
I've done. So perfectionism has, like I described, it has these two kind of ways of being, right? One is either like really on and forward and like, I have to grab the steering wheel, and if I don't do the things, nothing's going to happen. And the other is the kind of like completely, well, there's just no point, right? I might as well, I tried this thing once and I wasn't very good at it, so I'll quit and I won't do anything. And so, you can really feel that in your body, and I'm curious for you, like, which is the one that you identify with the most?
For me, it's definitely more the posturing one.
Okay.
But then if I reach a limit of that, then I'll go into the collapse.
Yeah.
So it's not so much the avoidance piece for me. It's more the posturing and driving through. And it's actually interesting because what I observed, I actually went through Rick Smith, who was also a teacher of authentic relating. I went through one of his retreats, and we speak about this one story that's like most predominant, most alive for us. And the biggest one for me was, I'm afraid that I'm a coward. And so for me, I could never go into the avoidance piece, right? Because I had to be the guy who's brave and who's courageous, and I had to move through, right? And so I would always find a way to try to make it happen, but then naturally I would reach overwhelm, and then that's where the collapse would come. And then that's where the internalized shame comes in, and I would just whip myself and just punish myself for that.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. Yeah. And so as you were talking, when I was noticing this, your hands were doing this a lot and this a lot, right? Which is like that's the embodiment of this form of perfectionism. How do I grip? How do I move forward?
Fight, right?
Yeah. And so there's something at its most basic level is, well, do something different. Like, so what would it be like to continue to feel like you're moving forward whilst like softening your hands, right? For me, it's like staying connected with the back of my body. So I notice this when I'm teaching on Zoom a lot, that I can tend to like start to lean forward, like everything kind of comes forward, and that's when the control starts to come in. So for me, it's like, okay, well, if I can keep, and I'm not leaning all the way back, but if I can keep a connection to the back of my body, my gaze goes a little bit softer. So now I can see like the edges of the room again, and it's not all about the thing. I'm like, oh yeah, now I'm seeing like there are other resources. I'm still connected to me. So okay, now I'm feeling like I'm getting tired. I need to take a break. So, and that's like the most basic version of it, right? Is that you can simply practice this with your embodiment, with your shaping.
Yeah, I believe this is really valuable, especially because from my experience, the more I was trying to exert this coping mechanism into my life, the more disconnected I would become from my own body. And it would really lead into a strong sense of disembodiment where I would not even observe or notice my primal urges for going into the washroom or wanting to get food because there was such a very linear, one-pointed way of trying to exert my attention towards this thing that I'm trying to accomplish, trying to achieve. So simply starting to find gentle ways, as you already were touching on, to start bringing our awareness back into the body and just bringing some of that attention as well down from the head, from the neck up, and really starting to feel into, okay, what's actually happening within my body. From my observations and from my own experiences, it just allows me to be a bit more intentional and slow everything a little bit down, because usually I find that when I get into that mode, things get really quick and I feel like I need to just like sprint through life.
Yeah. And I would say like there's nothing inherently wrong with that linear single point of focus attention. Like for some things in life, that is a highly appropriate, very effective way to be. The issue with all of this is when you get stuck, right? And you sort of talked about the kind of like the it's like a really ineffective way to drive, right? Accelerator down, go fast, right? Oh God, now I've overdone it. Quick, whack the brakes on. Everything goes backwards. Yeah, it's really discombobulating, if nothing else. And this is one of the reasons I like cyclical living, for example, because balance, this sense of wholeness and balance, isn't about trying to perfectly be in this place all of the time where my attention is exactly back and forward. It's like, oh no, I can move. And so there are periods when, yeah, I want to be fully focused on the thing. And then I want to be able to transition out of that and come back into like a little bit of rest and come back into my body and be like, okay, right, what is it, right? What do I need to be able to recharge my batteries now? And then to be able to transition smoothly back into a period of focus. And you can track that over, the basic activity rest cycle in the body is around 120 minutes for most people. So a couple of hours, 90 to 120 minutes. And for most people, like you'll start to notice that after about an hour and a half, like it's harder to focus. You have to, like, your body's having to work harder to do that. And that's your body going, hello, we need a break, right? So you can track that little cycle over the course of an hour. You can track over the course of a day, over a week. And it's the same kind of like fractal pattern of, right, I can really be in for a period of time. And then how am I transitioning back out, recharging, and then transitioning back in, rather than this kind of like binary on or off, which, that feels awful.
Yeah. And I notice as well, it's very ineffective in my own life. I can see that I can sometimes push the edges and go beyond those 120 minutes that you communicated. But I do notice over time that sharpness, that clarity, that precision that I may have, it does wear off, right? And so if I don't really give myself adequate rest or really find ways as well to really nourish myself, then the way I'm showing up, it doesn't have that same precision with it. It's kind of like using a saw that's not very sharp anymore, right? And it has like really become very dull.
Yeah.
And so it actually does really support and really require those moments for rest. One of the things I heard you speak of, which I think could be as well really valuable for us to bring in, is you spoke about embodiment, and you spoke around how awareness plus range equals choice. I'm curious to hear more about that because, personally, having dove into a lot of embodiment work as well in my own life, I found the great value of range and really finding ways to explore playing different notes, let's say, of how to live my life. And from my experience, especially, I notice how that softened in many ways, that desire to control things, and as well needing things to be a particular way, because I found an ability to be more with what is like showing up in the moment. So I'm curious to hear, how does that apply in your life, and how do you bring that as well into your work?
Yeah. So yeah, awareness plus range equals choice is a very simple equation that I learned from one of my teachers, Mark Walsh. And it's that, like, it just says that awareness on its own is never enough. And actually awareness on its own can be deeply frustrating. There's nothing worse than becoming aware that you've got a pattern and not being able to do anything about it.
Sure.
And so you have to develop range. And a way to think about range, from Mark, I work with this 4 elements model. Okay, so you think about earth and air as 2 poles, fire and water as 2 poles, and you probably instantly got like a sense of what those ways of being are. And what I really like about it is, again, it says there's no right or wrong answer. But again, if the only way that you can show up in the world is with this, like, really, well, what we've been kind of focusing most on is like this quite fiery way of being, like really focus. So another way to talk about fire is focus, like focus, passion, on, determined, single point, this direction. Then it's really hard to be adaptable to life. Yeah, it's like, so now I have to try and control everything to make it work for that way of being. Whereas when I have more range and I can, I feel comfortable and authentic in an expression that's got more flow, for example, that's more relational, that can feel a little more adaptable, right? Or when I can be more airy and more playful, I can kind of like go back and like, oh yeah, look, all the space in between, and yeah, okay, there's possibility here, and or I can step into something that's like really earthy and kind of structured and stable. Like, right, this needs a plan. Like, how do I bring order to this kind of chaos? Like, when I can develop range in those different directions, I feel authentic and comfortable in all of those expressions of me. So I don't need the world to change. I can adapt. Like, I've got more space in myself. I'm kind of imagining that character from Fantastic Four that kind of like, can like just like expand. And like, no, okay, look, right now I can hold all of this. And what's really important for me is, like, I haven't stopped being me. Like, I'm just a more like flexible, adaptive version of me, because authenticity isn't fixed. And there's, like, I'm away with you right now, conscious like there are cameras and things, and I'm different when I, am with a one-to-one client, or when I teach a group, or when I'm with my parents, or like, of course I am. It'd be really weird if I wasn't. So we have like a natural sense of range, and what embodied practice of any flavor does when it's done well is it expands the natural limits of our comfort zone to say, oh, well, I've always been a really serious person, and I'm serious and earthy. I'm like, okay, so what would it be like to practice, and as a deliberate practice? And it gets kind of funny here, especially like practicing air kind of things, because you have to, if you come at it with a very like earthy, right, I'm going to practice at 4 o'clock every day, and I'm going to practice exactly like this, then I'm not practicing air, I'm practicing earth again. So I'm like, okay, right, how do I spontaneously practice being airy and playful? But the more I do that, the more it's like, oh yeah, this is just another expression of me. So yeah, so that's what really, for me, underlines like what genuine choice is.
Yeah, I love that. And it brings a lot more intention around what is here in this moment, and as well what's really needed. And the more range we cultivate to be more flexible in the way that we show up, it actually allows us to more, I'm going to say, effectively respond to our environment. You said the word authenticity a few times, and I'm curious to hear, how would you define authenticity?
My most simple definition these days is that I don't abandon myself. So, in this flexibility of being responsive to the world, it is not a passive kind of people pleasing, oh, I let the world do things to me. Like, there's an inherent dignity to it. Like, I can be responsive And one of the things I'm responsive to is me and my needs. So I get to kind of really stand in my dignity and my strength. Be like, yeah, it's like a tree, something that's really rooted, and at the same time, like the branches move in the wind.
Sure.
Yeah. And there's actually this idea that trees that, I think they were experimenting with growing trees in windless environments for like Mars trips and things like that. And they realized that the trees didn't grow very tall because without the developed resilience of resisting the wind, the trees didn't grow strong enough roots, so that
Interesting.
they wouldn't grow high and they'd just fall over.
Right.
So like we need we need to develop that kind of strength and resistance in order to be able to grow. So for me, authenticity is not it's not vulnerability. It's not radical honesty. It's not transparency. It's this sense of I won't abandon myself. Like I can choose what I share with another person. And like I'm deeply connected with what's true for me, and then I'm making a choice about how am I showing up with what's going on in here and what's going on out there in a way that's in service.
Yep. Yeah. That's beautifully put. I like that. I like that definition. I haven't heard of that way, and love to expand a little bit more on that. And you've addressed or mentioned authentic relating a few times. And, that is one conversation I would love to segue into with you. First of all, perhaps you can take a moment just to describe what is authentic relating, just for the listeners who have not heard about it, this modality. And as well, how did you find your way into it, and what did it give you?
So authentic relating is another form of conscious communication practice. It's a lot in common with nonviolent communication or radical honesty, those kind of practices. It's essentially a little suite of tools and practices to help you build more nourishing, more meaningful relationships, firstly with yourself and then with anybody that you meet in the world. I first came across it back in 2018, a while ago now. I was at a little festival. I'd had a really bad breakup, and I was chatting to somebody, and I bemoaning the fact that I seemed to miss the lesson that everybody else seemed to get, or at least I imagine everybody else got at school, about building friendships and relationships. My father was in the Air Force. We moved around a lot. I developed some really really good coping strategies at the time, but habits that did not prove very helpful for me as an adult in forming relationships. And this person I was talking to, he was like, "Oh, that's yeah." He was obviously compassionate with that. He was like, "A friend of mine is like teaching this workshop in London next weekend, and I think you might really like it." So I turn up at this thing. I don't really know. I don't know anybody there. At this point in 2018, I'd been out of the Air Force for maybe 3 years, 4 tops. I'd been working for myself for about 6 months. I'd had a career in like international development, so very much still this high risk, very driven kind of industry. I'd been to 1 5 rhythms class. Hadn't heard of ecstatic dance, hadn't come to Bali by that point. And I walk into this room and it is full of what I can only describe as hippies. And I'm a little mortified. I'm like, who are these people? What is this? And I find myself in a little corner of the room, back against the wall. Like, I'm not sure I like this. And this guy comes towards me, and he's really intense, and he leans in. He's like, "Hi, hello. Tell me what is your biggest desire in life?" I think I just want to go and get a cup of tea. And that was my introduction to authentic relating. And, a few minutes later, we're sat in this circle of like 30 people, and everybody is like articulately and eloquently like narrating their internal present moment experience. And I'm like, what the hell is this? I don't know how to do this. So by the time it's my turn, I'm absolute floods of tears. And all I can do is kind of be like, I don't know how to do this. I can't feel anything below my neck. And ironically, as a now very dear friend of mine said afterwards, she was like, you did the thing. Like, you told us exactly what it was like to be you in that moment. And I have to say, you did it with more authenticity than anybody else did, because it was so real. And I was hooked. Like, for me, it was this, I think it was one of the first times in my life I had given myself permission, that I'd like felt this explicit permission from the outside that I could just be me. And with all of the messiness, and then like, I don't know how to do this, and I don't feel anything. Like, I'm like, oh, that's the answer.
Yeah.
Because I'd have this pattern in relationships where I would have this really strong freeze response, particularly in romantic relationships. Like, I would be with a man, and I'm like, you expect something from me. I can tell. Like, you want me to be a particular way right now, and I don't know what it is. So I'm gonna sit here and say nothing and do nothing and hope. I don't know. Hope that like you pass me by. It's gonna be okay again.
Right.
And authentic relating gave me like permission to be like, oh, I can say that I don't know what the right thing to do is right now. And like that can be a gateway back into connection. And I was doing that, and I was having people on the other side like not run away from me.
Yeah.
Or not make me wrong. And they were like, hi, that's really nice to know you. What is this? Witchery. But I was hooked. So
Oh, that's beautiful. Wow. I mean, so much in what you said, and I appreciate you as well, really setting the scene and the stage of how this first moment was for you. And yeah, really want to as well take a moment just to highlight one element that really stood out for me. And recently I had a conversation with an individual called Dewey Freeman. He is actually very well known in the elements of attachment and development, especially of younger ages. And we spoke about this idea as well that, authenticity is really about congruency about what's happening with myself internally, and as well knowing how I express that externally, and there being an alignment with that.
yeah.
And that's really what stood out for me as well when I heard you speak about that first share, when it was your moment to really speak, that there was a congruency
Yeah.
of what you felt inside and how you addressed that externally. And how often like are there moments when we're feeling something inside, and then someone asks us, "Oh, how are you doing?" "Oh, I'm good. No, everything is fine." Right? Like, or I would say that was definitely kind of more my posturing that I at least have come from initially. And so there is something incredibly liberating about the fact that, first of all, I don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. And second of all, other individuals can receive us if we as well bring other flavors, or saying, you know what, I'm having a really shitty day. I'm not doing well. Right.
Yeah.
And there's something about that gives us an opportunity to be more ourselves, and actually as well find the courage to accept that as well.
Yeah. And there's a nuance here.
Okay.
Like, so this is where I'd say that, like, for me, authenticity isn't about transparency or necessarily even honesty. Right? It's just not abandoning myself. So this congruency doesn't mean that, like, if I'm noticing all this stuff, it doesn't mean that it has to come out of my mouth.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's lots of times where, and like, that's not appropriate, or like the person that I'm with, I'm like,
yeah.
Well, I know that you're having a really hard day, so like there's a dance here. And I often say in my workshops, like, the most authentic thing that you can say in a workshop like this is, I don't want to say anything right now. Because in that, it's like, yeah, I'm acknowledging that there is something here, and I'm acknowledging that I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But in naming that, I'm still able to bring it into connection.
Yeah.
And that for me is a really important nuance in this, that I don't have to say everything that I notice.
Yeah.
I can still have agency in that. I'm still mindful of how that might land with somebody else, what's going on for them. I'm mindful of my own safety. Like, is this somebody who can receive me? I love my parents deeply, and they're being incredibly supportive at the moment. And there's stuff that, I'll tell them's going on, and because of who they are and how they've developed, like, they want to fix me. And like, that doesn't feel good for me. So it's like, okay, like, I choose not to share all of this with them, because the person I am choosing to share it with first is me. And it's like, that's where the awareness piece comes in. Again, like, this is like the first relationship that I have, being deeply connected to me, and then choosing how I share that with the people around me.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable distinction. Appreciate you as well bringing that, because I think that is definitely an incredible nuance. And I think the fine line here that stood out for me was to bring that in connection, meaning that there is something that's alive where we're like, I don't want to maybe communicate this, or it doesn't feel safe for me, or it feels more honoring to actually not share it. But how can I then address that in such a way that, can be done that where we can create more of a relationality
Yeah.
of the moment versus that being disconnecting. Because
Yeah.
there's been many moments as well that I have tried to not share because I knew it wasn't safe for me, and I wanted to protect myself. But I noticed how when I did that, it was actually leading to disconnection. And the reason was because I was more hiding at
Yeah.
that moment. And then there's nothing wrong with that, but I was noticing in the moments when I actually wanted to be in connection that it took away from that, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a beautiful nuance here that
Yeah.
you communicated.
Well, no, it circles back to something you were talking about earlier in terms of the ineffectiveness of always being on in this kind of like linear form of focus. Because it's not just kind of productivity that suffers, our creativity suffers because creativity isn't linear and focused. It's out here and random connections, and our relationality suffers.
Yes.
Like when I was in the Air Force, I was deployed to Afghanistan for several months with a squadron of tornadoes, and I was the only intelligence officer on the squadron. I was working 7 days a week for the whole 4 months that we were there. We were being regularly shelled by the Taliban. Like, it was a really high intensity, and I was this the whole time. And to the point where I had a corporal who, how old was I at the time? I was 27. My corporal was in his early 40s. He was like a married man with a couple of kids. And I was being such a bitch to him that he complained to our boss. And it's not that I was deliberately being a bitch to him. I wasn't being like mean or vindictive. I had zero capacity for feeling. Like, me, empathy or compassion for him, like, none of that mattered. It was like, we've got to get the job done. And what I now know in hindsight, looking back, is like, oh no, and it wasn't just me. Like, we were all in this kind of state. But that our ability to get the job done was being impacted by the fact that we weren't able to be in relationship with each other.
Yeah.
We were missing out on like so much capacity and support because, and it wasn't important. That's not what we were trained to do in that kind of environment. But relationality, I'm discovering more and more. And again, like the relationship with myself as well as the relationship with people around me, like whether it's efficient or not is actually kind of irrelevant. But like, for me, like, what are we doing in the world if it's not about building connection and relationship with each other?
Yep.
Like, I know we get fed this kind of like hyper individualized, do it all yourself, hit the 30 under 30 list, and like be a star, be like the hero in your own story. And I'm like, I don't think that's how we function as humans. We're inherently relational and social, and we are meant to be connected to each other. We are meant to be connected to the land, to ritual, to all of these different things. And we cannot do that if we're like here all the time.
This is something I want to dive more deeply into with you, because one of the things that I often observe is the moment a man comes to me and wants to work with me is often because relational challenges are starting to present themselves. And what I often observe, it's because they've been in this mode for so long, they have completely, I'm going to say, abdicated complete leadership over their relational landscape. And truthfully, they just don't know how to navigate this field. It's kind of like complete unknown territory for them. And so this is something that, I really have a really dear soft spot for a lot of men, because we're taught in many ways to disconnect from ourselves, and as well that we need to have everything figured out, and that we need to achieve, we need to acquire, we need to dominate. And that doesn't really allow us the capacity to really cultivate those skills for like relationship ultimately. And this is why I wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into authentic relating, and potentially at least provide a few nuggets here for some of the listeners here, just to I guess, bring or broaden their perspectives on this idea of how to stay in relationship. I'm curious to hear. I think what could be really valuable is to speak a little bit into the I believe it's the 5 core tenets or the 5 practices of authentic relating. Could you speak to some of those and how those as well apply in relationship?
Yeah. So the 5 core practices come specifically from an organization called ART, so Jason Diggs and Raul Castano. And it's to welcome everything, which we've spoken to already, which is this like deeply courageous, in my view, turning towards reality as it is, not to tolerate or to acquiesce, but to be able to take like deeply informed, responsive action in the world. Okay, so welcome everything. The next practice is formally called assume nothing, which is impossible for anybody with a human brain. It's not how our brains function. I much prefer to talk about it as check your assumptions. And we're making assumptions about ourselves and other people all of the time. Like it's a totally natural function of being human. Anybody says, oh, I'm not judgmental. That's not true. You're either lying about it or you don't notice, and neither one of those is okay. Is an attractive feature to me. So check your assumptions. Is that true? Like, this is a story that I have about you. This is what I think. Is that true? And again, like, it means that our assumptions don't act as a block to connection. They start to serve as a gateway into connection. It almost doesn't matter whether the assumption is true or not. Like, what I'm doing is now like connecting with you about it. So welcome everything, check your assumptions. The third practice is to reveal your experience, which is kind of what we were speaking to earlier. This invitation to have like other people come and join you in your world. And again, it is this kind of, it's this beautiful dance of both like active and receptive, like to open up to people, like it takes agency and a deliberate choice, especially for those of us that are used to hiding behind the armor, and it's vulnerable. Like, that's how I know I'm doing it, because I get this, like, the amount of energy in my body when I'm being deeply vulnerable. I'm really inviting somebody in, and it's a choice. Like, it's not about, say, being totally transparent all the time, but if you want people to know you, you have to allow yourself to be known. In that then is the fourth practice, which is to own your experience. And that is to take some like radical responsibility for ourselves. And again, not very encouraged in our culture. And we tend to oscillate between blame and shame, right? It's either all your fault or it's all my fault. And of course it's both. And so owning your experience invites you to come into that place of like, yes, I want to be impacted by other people. I think that's what it means to be in connection. I want to feel what is happening. And at the same time, nobody's making me feel anything. Like, there's an interaction between what's happening in the world around me and all of my history and experiences and shaping that is alchemizing into something, a particular flavor and experience for me. And it is both of those things at the same time. So I can take responsibility for what's mine in that. And I get to co-create the experiences that I want. So it's back to range, right? I don't need the world to be a specific way for me to have the feelings that I want to have. I can be like an active participant. I'm an agent in that. And then finally, the practice of honor self and honor other. So one way to think about authentic relating is like authentic relating. It's a dance of polarities. How do I hold two things as true at the same time? It's like the both and. So rather than relationships being this zero-sum game where either like you're getting what you want or I'm getting what I want, or we're compromising to the point where neither of us are really getting what we want, like, how do we do both? Like, how do I really stand in my dignity to know myself, to know my boundaries, my needs, my desires as they change, like those are not fixed. How am I bringing them into relationship in a way that I can allow them to be met and I'm not attached to the outcome, which is a skill that I'm still learning. And then how am I doing that with another person who is also going through all of that? How am I being curious about what it is that they want, need, and desire without making the assumptions? And we're in this dance of honor self and honor other. Like, this possibility that it gets to be both and. And I think that might be the hardest thing about relationships. Like, I don't know about you, but I think adulting is quite hard most of the time. I spend a lot of time going, damn it, I wish I'd been more appreciative of being like 6 and, everything being solved by a Mr. Bump Plaster. So adulting is hard. And to know myself, to be able to honor myself deeply and not abandon me, and then do that for like a whole other person, like, I say it's hard, and not as in like it requires a lot of slog all of the time, but it does require you to show up, and it requires you to listen and to put some effort in. And it's complex. Like, there are not always straightforward answers to what that middle ground looks like, but it does exist if we can get out of this either or binary, it's all about me or it's all about you kind of thinking that most of us have developed.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's so much gold in just what you said. And I feel like these 5 core practices, this could be a podcast in itself. I mean, there's so much.
I mean,
there.
it's like it's a 2-day training and another 2-day training.
That's it,
and then
right?
Yeah.
Right. So a few podcasts, let's say. Okay. But my encouragement just to all the listeners is maybe just pause the podcast here for a moment and really listen in and really feel into how does everything that Vix has just said, how does that apply into my life? How do all these practices show up, and what could be refined? What is something that I can deepen more deeply into? That would really be my high encouragement to all of you. And I think the thing as well that I would really want to comment on, there is no way of being able to do all of that perfectly, coming back into that desire of the perfectionist to, all right, authentic relating, 5 core practices, let me fucking master all of that and let me see how I can do that. Life is dynamic. Life is completely alive. There is, things happen, like one moment we're, at the top of our game, and then something happens and then we're really at the bottom. And my curiosity is, well, how can we meet each moment by moment in a more elegant way where we can just accept what is happening and really bring our, I'm going to say, our best practice to it, recognizing that we won't be able to do it perfectly.
Well, this is why they're called practices.
Yeah.
Right? They're not principles. They're not like something to aspire to and be like, yes, there's a version of this where it's perfect. It's like, no, it's a practice in something that requires me to practice. It's a skill that I can develop, but it's a way of being. And it's back to what we were talking with the acceptance of perfectionism. Like, you can approach all of this with a particular mindset that looks like you're doing the thing. Like, I see this a lot in kind of people that practice nonviolent communication, that you can be saying the right words, but you're not actually embodying the thing.
Totally. I've seen people like use this modality and still weaponize it against each other and shame each other and blame each other, even with that structure,
Yeah, totally. So it's not the tools and the structures and things are a helpful way to be in practice, but it's really about the embodiment and the way of being. And like, there's no end to that. I know the welcome everything practice. There's always more that I can create space for. Always more that I can welcome in. But if I'm coming at it from that way of being, of how might I welcome everything a little bit more deeply now? It doesn't matter whether I am or not. Like, the way of being is what's really important. Like, am I bringing compassion to this? Am I bringing curiosity to this? And suddenly we're into Richard Sforza's 8 C's of like self-leadership, like from the IFS model. Like, if I'm really, like, again, not as a source of perfection, like ticking it off, but like, how am I? These are verbs, right? Like, they are actions that I do, like ways that I am in the world. And sometimes I'm able to do more of that than other times. But it's the intentionality and the embodiment of it for me that's really, really important.
I would like to hone into one of those, and I believe it was the 4th one that you spoke of. And I explored this idea of like revealing our experience and like really as well working with those more tender aspects of ourselves. And this is something as well that I notice a lot of the men that I work with have difficulties with. And it's there's this fine line, because it's essential ultimately if I want to be in relationship with the person in front of me, but simultaneously there is this like deeply wired aspect. I'll speak for myself, like in me, that believes I need to have it all figured out. I need to be solid. I need to be centered. I can't be swaying everywhere, right? And I think the thing that I really cut myself off from in many ways was the sense of being messy and being really like just alive. And it's so interesting because that element of me is so innate. Like, I mean, growing up, I was this wild man, who was just so alive, and it was just clumsy, and it was just like all over the place. And in a way, I felt like I had to disconnect myself from that element. And this mechanism of perfectionism came in because, I've been shunned, I've been humiliated, I've been shamed for that part of me. And now I'm like trying to like temper this aspect of me and be like, okay, how do I need to move through the world so I can keep myself in check, so I can keep as well my environment in check. And while this may be, unique and distinct to me, I see that as well being present for a lot of men, and as well, just in the desire of not really revealing those elements of ourselves that are a bit more tender, a bit more vulnerable, a bit more fragile. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to the importance of bringing these vulnerable elements to the person that we may be, in contact with, and how that as well plays in terms of creating connection.
Mm. Thank you for like sharing like those kind of vulnerable tender. And I imagine like they feel a little less tender now, having like, and this is where, because I had authenticity. Like, one of my senses as you're sharing this is that your relationship with those parts is different now. So as you're able to kind of accept and welcome those bits back in.
Still a process, but
Yeah, of
getting
course,
better for sure.
Of course it is. But like what I noticed for me is that the more I'm able to hold all of those parts of myself and not make them wrong, the less I need the world to kind of like validate me being a certain way. So there's an aspect of that, but I really recognize like the dynamic that you're speaking to. I think it manifests for men in a slightly different way to women, but like again, this is a function of the society that we live in that says wildness, nature. No, from Descartes onwards, and probably before that, like the body has been considered unclean, and it's all about kind of like the rational mind, and that's what being a good person is about. We've like divorced ourselves from our natural, messy, dirty, hands in the earth kind of ways of being. So again, like this is not an individual an individual manifestation of a much bigger like global problem that we have. I think for me, like this is what it means to be whole. Say like I'm not a machine, I'm not a robot. I don't do things right, whatever that means, all of the time. These parts that are, for me, the tenderness comes from like because they are less seen.
Yeah.
Like, and there's something really powerful about this revealed experience practice and allowing people in and saying, I trust you. Like, I trust me. Like, no matter what you do, I trust me now. Like, that I can hold these parts, but I'm trusting you with this stuff that feels a little more tender to me. It's like I have cats at home, and we've had them since they were really tiny kittens, so they're really comfortable with having their bellies rubbed. And like, it's a sign in cats of deep trust, right? Because it's the underside, it's the soft, like this is the vulnerable bit. Like, you get attacked here and you get like seriously hurt, whether that's like emotionally or physically. But it's a sign of trust. And oh my God, I love it when my cats do that. I'm like, oh, you love me, you trust me, right? That's what it means to be in relationship. It's again, it's like all of the both and, because my story is that like if you're trusting me with your tender vulnerable bits, then it means I can trust you with mine. Right? There's this kind of, there's a mutual reciprocity.
Yep.
Or mutually assured destruction, depending like which way around you want to you want to play with it. But it's like, yeah, there's a dynamic there, and like I said, I think it's incredibly brave, like especially in a world that says that we have to be a particular way, and that being messy, being clumsy, making mistakes, all the rest of it, like isn't okay. To be you in the world,
Yep.
it's like the most courageous thing that you can do. And I feel deeply honored when people trust me with that aspect of them. I'm not that interested in getting to know the mask. I mean, that gets to be part of it because that's also part of you. But like, what I'm really interested in is like, what's really going on in there?
Yeah.
Because when I feel that aliveness in you, it helps me feel like I feel that aliveness in me too. Like that's connection.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And yeah, just as you were speaking as well, I was reflecting on the moments when I would really bring that part of me out. And usually in the past, I've reserved it very much for my, partners, my female partners, or very close male friends, or even, brothers within a men's circle, or maybe, a contained space where there was that trust that was built over time. And there was something really special about bringing those parts forth that usually I would feel it doesn't feel really safe for me to bring that. And there is a level of connection that I felt to myself and as well towards the other person because they saw me in that. And there's something about it that usually, I mean, there was an aliveness just there and a sense of like appreciation. It always brought us in some way together. I think what I often observe, at least, and this is maybe more specific to some of the men that I speak to, is there's this fear of addressing those vulnerable aspects of themselves because a fear of maybe a woman not being attracted to that, or feeling like she may not want to, or she'll become disinterested. So because they've definitely had moments where that has been the case, where they have revealed ultimately their heart to another individual, and that was ultimately not received by the other individual. And then it really came to this element of, well, this part of me is not safe. Fuck that. I'm not going to bring this out to anybody else. Right. And so, yeah, just really want to as well speak to that individual. And the thing that I personally observed, that it's such a, at least for myself, it was such a great disservice actually to completely suppress those parts and put them in the basement and never look at them, because that, as you said, and magnify the tenderness that's around those elements. And also, I never learned how to work with them. I never learned how to fully be with them. And it was by the being with them, or learning to as well address any needs that this aspect of me requires. It gave me a sense of, I'm going to say, confidence of how to be with those parts when they do show up. And as well learning how to bring those more tender parts to safe people who will fully receive us in the moments when we do bring that forth. So I think that's kind of the nuance that I wanted to provide here.
Yeah. And it's worth, there's a couple of things I want to just pick up on there, that yeah, we all grew up in these same waters. So of course, women have internalized this just as much as men have. So yeah, like there will be women who don't find that attractive. There will be people who don't respond well. And again, this is back to the authenticity of like, I don't abandon myself. Like my sense of self-worth isn't dependent on other people, without going to the other extreme where it's like, well, now I'm just cut off and I won't depend on anybody. So yes, of course. So we've all had those experiences, and I have a lot of compassion for all of us that have shown something vulnerable and not had the response that we wanted. And the other thing you spoke to there was the importance of practice. Like, it's called kind of calibration, or like titration, that you don't just go from like one extreme to the other. Like that's how you hurt yourself, right? And you might get lucky, you might do it and you might have a really good experience, but your nervous system is shot to bits because it doesn't feel safe. And this is the thing about nervous systems. It's not about objective reality, whether it is or isn't safe. It's how does your nervous system perceive it based on the experiences it's had before, where, as a child particularly, that type of rejection is fundamentally not safe. Like, we're so dependent as children on our caregivers. Like, that kind of rejection is potentially fatal. Gabor Mate talks about secure attachment versus authentic expression, and we'll always choose secure attachment over authenticity every single time. So this thing about like practicing, and that's why things like men's circles, women's circles, authentic relating, coaching, therapy, they are ways of giving your nervous system new data points, like new felt senses of like, okay, I could let this little bit out, and okay, nothing terrible's happened. Okay, that's interesting. Right, and next time I can do that. Oh no, nothing terrible happened again this time either. Okay, great. And so you're starting to like repattern, and it takes practice. It takes a lot of time and practice, and getting it wrong, and being able to regulate in the face of that, and over time, like being able to do that with more and more people. Still honoring for me that like that's what it means to be close to me. Like, you want to have an intimate relationship, like I don't share those most intimate parts with everybody. Like that's part of this. I get to be selective, and for me it comes back to like that gets to be my choice, my active choice. I'm not run by patterns and ways of being that developed when I was 6, or I'm not dependent on how you're going to respond to that. There's a dignified interdependence that can develop.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were speaking, I was reminded by the words of your colleague and one of my mentors, Rick Smith, who speaks of this idea of exploring our tender edge, right, where we have one foot in safety, and then we can take the other foot and explore a little bit, like at our edge, like that where we're kind of feeling a little bit of that unease or that sense of, I don't know if this is safe. I don't know if I can do this, and all of that. And then we touch on that, and then we titrate back into safety afterwards. And that's kind of how we expand that range over time, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, really wanting to as well honor our time together. And there's a closing question I'd have, but before I dive into that, I'm curious to hear, where can our listeners find you, and is there anything that you would like our listeners to have more awareness of?
I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. I don't think anybody else has my name, so Vix Anderton on Google, on Instagram, LinkedIn, like those are my main places. I am teaching authentic relating quite regularly. I teach here in Bali on a weekly basis in Ubud. I teach the 2-day workshop a couple of times a year in person, and I teach online around the world as well. So if the authentic relating stuff has sounded interesting, and it is an embodied practice, like you don't just get to sit at home and read a book. It's like learning to ride a bike. Like you actually have to get on the bike and go and do it at some point. So there's that, and I'd make a case for cyclical living for everybody. Like I think it's a practice that benefits. It might actually even benefit men more than it benefits women. Like women have a sort of like the menstrual cycle gives us a natural kind of initiation into cyclical living a lot of the time. There's specific work for women there. I would love to see more men bringing more of this kind of like cyclical way of being. I think it's in deep service of men's lives and the world. Yeah.
Beautiful. And one thing I want to touch on, you have a book as well, right?
I do have
it's
a
called
book.
Enough, an Imperfect Antidote to Perfectionism.
Yeah.
I bought it. I haven't read it yet, but I'm very keen on diving into that conversation.
Yeah. It's a very short read as well. It's about an hour if you read it at sort of an average pace, and you're reading the final chapter. I had this whole thing about like, is it long enough? Have I done enough?
Yeah.
Like, do I need to write more? Yeah. And then making this really active decision of like, oh, I think I've said everything I want to say. And I might just allow it to be enough.
Nice.
And that kind of informed the title.
Beautiful. Well, I'll definitely as well put that in the show notes so the listeners can as well find some information on that or buy it if they desire to do that. Yeah, for me, it's always been like this conversation around how I close in these conversations off. I think one thing that I would really personally like to do with you, Vix, is I'm curious to hear if there's maybe some form of authentic relating practice that we can bring in here that our listeners can start to apply in our lives. I'm wondering if there's something, very quick, easy, and tangible that people can use and will already greatly enhance maybe their relationships.
Yeah. It's both from authentic relating and from like the work that reconnects, like an active hope practice, and that's it's a little bit of appreciation. So one thing that we could do over like 1 or 2 minutes is for me to share some appreciation of you and how I've gotten to know you over this time, and vice versa. And I highly encourage people to do this. Like when you go for coffee with a friend or you go for dinner, like end the conversation and say like, I've really enjoyed spending the time with you because like, I love the way you show up with this. Like acknowledge, appreciate each other and like what you bring to each other's lives. I think it's a beautiful practice.
I would absolutely love to do that. And it's interesting because before the closing of every podcast, I like to acknowledge my guests. And I realize I haven't done that yet with you. So this fits really perfectly. Let me just kind of begin, I would say, and then you can go with anything that feels alive for you. So Vix, I first of all just really want to acknowledge you for coming on the podcast, for making the way down to Canggu, all the way from Ubud, which is an hour and a half, at least it was for you. And I really appreciate as well kind of just the time that you invested here, and as well all the insights that you brought, the depth of vulnerability that you as well brought to really share your personal experiences and weave those into the conversation. We as well had a coaching session 1.5 years ago. I remember that. And I remember as well working with you around elements of, I believe, confidence that were really playing out at that time. And I remember that conversation was really supportive. And I think the thing that I really appreciate about you, from what I know about you, and we've only had this conversation so far, is it seems to me that you're really about embodying what it is that you're teaching and what it is that you're sharing. And the sense I'm getting about you is that it's really important for you to be in integrity with that, and not bring anything that that you don't necessarily embody, and you really stand by that. And I really feel that you're a stand for relationship and connection, and really being more in connection as well with the flow of nature.
Just receive a breath with that. I know it's my turn, and I notice I have like a lot of curiosity of like how that feels for you. I'm like tracking your face, and I do want to check in. Like, how is that to share?
Yeah, sure. I'm noticing I have a big smile right now. I'm feeling a slight aliveness in my belly. I feel my chest feels more expansive, and I feel more openness, and just the sense of gratitude. It feels really good. Interesting.
Yeah. So I'm hearing it feels good to share gratitude, and I'm also hearing the aliveness of vulnerability. That sharing appreciation is an act of vulnerability, at least for me.
And I feel a sense of softness, where it was like before I was a podcast host, and there was a bit of a linear elements to me while trying to be in relationship as well at the same time. But I'm noticing I'm softer now. Which is interesting.
Yeah, kind of orientation to like, oh, there's a person here.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you. Really appreciate you sharing that. So what I think I have gotten more about you over this time together is a sense of your care and your dedication to what it is that you do. I'm imagining that you've done a level of like research. Like it sounds like some of the questions you were asking like said to me that you've like spent time like reading some of my work and engaging with it. And that's, I don't always experience that when I guest on other people's podcasts. And I really, I felt cared for in that moment. It's like, oh wow, this person actually has invited me here because they care about what I have to say. Like they're not going to be surprised by it. So I felt really cared for in those moments. I appreciate you role modeling some of the things that we've talked about, and yeah, kind of walking the talk of, I imagine, like the work that you do with people in the world of navigating, like, how do I do things in the world? How do I do them well? And learn to be more of myself in the world. So I appreciated the times that you've brought your personal stories in as well. Appreciate the curiosity that you've shown, and like the space to allow me to talk and to be more me. That strikes me as an incredible act of service. So thank you.
I feel deeply, deeply seen. Thank you. What was that like for you? I'm curious to hear. What are you feeling after communicating that? And as well, maybe how you received my acknowledgements and what you feel just after this little practice.
There is that like a little rush of like, how did that land? Did I do it right? Which is actually like the perfectionism like never really goes away, and it's also like a care. Like I want, there's an intentionality in my words of I want you to feel seen, and I want that to land. So some relief that it did. I noticed this sense of kind of like the cameras and the microphones like disappearing a little bit, and again this like more sense of like, oh yeah, there's a connection here. This is what I love about this like relational way of being, rather than like informational on the person, which is all really important, but like, oh, this like human to human connection, what's happening here and now, I have a lot of value in, and that's what I want more in the world. I'm like, oh, what would it be like to be here more and not spend all of my time worrying about how I get to the next place. Yeah.
Thank you, Vix. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I'm very certain that the listeners will have gotten a lot of value out of this conversation. And just in regards to this exercise as well, that is one of the questions I believe you guys bring as well in the 2-day workshop, which is really exploring, after a conversation, bringing this, prompt of what I feel like I know about you, or what I feel like I get about you now is this, and bringing that in, and just having these elements of intentionally, bringing these things forth, can already create so much more depth and so much more connection and so much more intimacy. So I highly encourage you to try that out with a partner or with a friend, or with whomever that feels aligned with. So thanks again, Vix, for coming on. This was an incredible conversation. I'm very grateful that we had it. For all the listeners who jumped on, I hope you got a lot of value out of this. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to both of us. And until next time, signing off.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Your time and attention is truly appreciated. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe to stay tuned for my upcoming episodes. And in case you know somebody who would find this episode helpful, I encourage you to pay it forward. Finally, if you've personally been receiving value from the show, one way you're able to support this podcast is by leaving a 5-star rating and a written review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Not only does this help more people find the show, but it also supports me in bringing more incredible guests on for the future. I'm your host, Alex Lehman, and until next time, signing off.